Switching from Windows or macOS to Linux can be a challenge, not just if you're a beginner, but also if you're a power user and even if you've used Linux before. There are hundreds of Linux distributions out there, each targeting a specific use case. Not to mention there are many distributions which don't target a use case at all and are instead intended for general purpose everyday use. So, choosing a Linux distribution can be confusing even for power users. Now, I was originally going to make a video where I explain what a distribution is, the different families that there are, how you choose your own, and then provide my recommendations. But that turned out to be too long a video, and nobody would watch that. So, I've decided to split this video into two parts, and that also allows me to be more focused to better explain each concept. In today's video, I'm going to give you an overview of the Linux distributions out there, starting with what a Linux distribution is, the core Linux distributions and their derivatives, and the things to look for when choosing a distribution. Then, in part 2, I'll be shortlisting distributions for different use cases and justifying my choices. So, let's get started. The aim of this video is not to tell you which Linux distribution is the best, because that doesn't really make any sense. All Linux distributions are still Linux at the end of the day. So what you can do with one, you can do with the other one. Instead, I'm going to show you what a Linux distribution is, where they come from, and most importantly, the major features that set them apart. Armed with that knowledge, you can then choose a distro that best serves your needs without having anyone tell you what to choose. Before choosing a Linux distribution, you need to know what a distribution is and the different families of distributions out there. Unlike Windows or macOS, Linux is not a single operating system made by one company. The name Linux actually refers to the Linux kernel, which is maintained by the Linux kernel project, headed by Linus Torvalds and supported by many individuals and organizations. Now, the kernel is a really important part of Linux or any operating system, but it's not an entire operating system. So, it's then up to a Linux distributor, which is either a project or a company, to bundle the Linux kernel with all the utilities one needs in an operating system, such as a graphical environment, system utilities, an office suite, a web browser, and so on. What these distributors create is a Linux distribution, which is where all the choice and admittedly confusion starts with Linux. Despite there being hundreds of distributions of Linux, most are based on one of three main distributions. First, there's Debian Linux. Debian is one of the oldest active Linux distributions and has spawned many derivatives. Debian is notable for being a stable and secure distro with a predictable release cycle, as well as the apt package repository containing tens of thousands of applications ready to install. The downside of the security and stability is that it can take a while for the latest version of software packages to be included in Debian, which is where Debian derivatives come in. Some of the most popular include Deepin, Ubuntu, MX Linux, and Kali Linux. Each of these derivatives has a purpose, such as Deepin, which focuses on a beautiful user experience, or Ubuntu, which is oriented towards beginners and provides a general purpose environment, or MX Linux, which is also targeted at newcomers, but with desktop and software choices that are better suited to lower-end machines. Then there's Kali Linux, which is focused on security and penetration testing. Ubuntu itself has spawned many other derivatives. The solid Debian based from the Debian project, coupled with an easy-to-use experience and updated software packaged by Canonical, the company behind Ubuntu, makes Ubuntu a popular choice to base a Linux distribution on. Some of the more popular Ubuntu derivatives include Pop! OS, made by Linux hardware manufacturer System76, Linux Mint, focused on providing a classic desktop experience, Elementary OS, which aims to provide a great user experience and curated app store, and Zorin OS, aimed at newcomers and offering some Windows compatibility out of the box. Ubuntu also has many derivatives which focus on providing an alternative desktop environment, such as KDE Neon, Kubuntu, Xubuntu or Xubuntu, I think it's Xubuntu, Ubuntu Budgie, and Lubuntu. Like Debian, Red Hat Linux is a long-running distribution of Linux, initially developed by the Red Hat Corporation, which was subsequently purchased by IBM. The focus of Red Hat has always been the corporate sector, offering software and support for Linux servers and corporate workstations. Red Hat has two derivatives which are actually primarily funded and developed by Red Hat themselves. This includes CentOS, which is an upstream version of Red Hat Linux, where new packages and patches are released before making their way into the main Red Hat distribution. It also includes Fedora, which itself is upstream from CentOS. This includes a friendly user interface and many times the absolute latest version of software, which may, however, require a more powerful machine to run and may be less stable. Moving away from the Red Hat-funded distros, there's Rocky Linux, which you can kind of see as an alternative downstream release from CentOS Stream, making Rocky Linux a community-supported Red Hat Enterprise Linux equivalent, similar to what CentOS used to be. And, similar to Rocky, Alma Linux is another community-supported Red Hat equivalent with much the same aims. Arch Linux is a Linux distribution aimed at competent to advanced users which, like Debian and Red Hat, is independent and has spawned many derivatives. Arch is notable for being a rolling release, meaning you'll always get the very latest software versions available. It also features a user repository from where you can get more software outside the official Arch repositories. One of the most popular Arch derivatives is Manjaro, which is a user-friendly, desktop-oriented distro which tames Arch Linux enough to be used by everyday users, whilst retaining the rich software ecosystem that Arch is famous for. Another derivative is EndeavourOS, which similarly makes Arch easy enough to use by beginners, and additionally offers several desktop options, including ones for mid to low-range machines. Garuda Linux is another popular derivative, which besides offering a pleasing user experience and easy installer, focuses on performance and system stability by including a built-in backup utility. Now, that list was far from comprehensive. After all, there are hundreds of Linux distributions out there, way over 300 according to some research, and that's just the ones which are made available to the public. Also, not all distributions are based on Debian, Red Hat, and Arch. Popular distributions such as Slackware and Gentoo, or is it Gentoo? No, I think it's Gentoo, like the penguin. Yeah, Gentoo are independent distributions and have their own derivatives. For example, Chrome OS is a derivative of Gentoo. Now, what I've mentioned are perhaps the most popular distributions with the largest user communities. It's important to know what the aim of the distro you're considering is. And the reason for this is that the family the distro belongs to won't tell you much about that. There are easy-to-use Arch derivatives, just like there are Debian derivatives made for power users. So you have to get down to the particular distro you're considering to see what the intended user type is. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean the family doesn't tell you anything about a distro. Indeed, it can tell you a lot. One factor which differentiates how Linux distributions are, distributed is their release cycle. Debian releases a new stable version roughly every 2 years. However, it also maintains testing and unstable branches for those wishing to try out newer software versions at the expense of stability. Consequently, Debian derivatives tend to follow a similar cycle. For example, Ubuntu releases a new version every 6 months, with each version being supported for 9 months. However, every 2 years, a long-term support or LTS version is released, which will continue to be supported for 5 years as standard, with the option to extend to 8 years. Debian and Ubuntu derivatives tend to follow this release system, although the time between releases and the support term varies between distributions. Red Hat releases a new major version of Enterprise Linux every 3 or 4 years, with full support for 5 years, maintenance support for another 5 years, and extended maintenance for an additional 2 years. If you imagine a stream, wait, you know what? I won't make you imagine it. Look, this is a stream. Now at the bottom here is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Upstream is CentOS Stream. This is what's known as a rolling release distribution. There are no major version numbers. Instead, software is added or updated when some testing and validation have been carried out, for a constantly updating distribution. Kind of like what Windows 10 was supposed to be before Windows 11 was released and a shock to everyone. Now further up in the stream we find Fedora, which gets packages even sooner but with less testing and less validation. Once a package is working well in Fedora, it makes its way downstream to CentOS and eventually to Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Finally, there are distributions which are purely based on a rolling release, such as Arch. When the Arch maintainers have tested and validated the package, they add it to Arch. End of story. There are no versions of Arch Linux. You just download a snapshot from a particular point in time, and your version keeps being updated in perpetuity. This may make it somewhat less useful as a server, but it does ensure you always get the latest and greatest software delivered right to your distribution. Another thing to consider is the desktop environment which your distribution provides by default. Unlike Windows and macOS, Linux has a wide selection of different desktop environments, from those resembling Windows to those resembling macOS, to those doing their own thing, and still others targeting power users or low-end hardware. A distribution will rarely force you to use a specific desktop environment. However, it does make sense to stick with the environment provided by your distro, since most of the utilities and apps provided by the distribution will be tailored to that environment. One of the most popular desktop environments is GNOME. This is used by Debian, Ubuntu, Pop!OS, Red Hat, Fedora, CentOS, and many others. GNOME focuses on simplicity and minimalism, and featuring a dock and top bar by default, macOS users should feel very familiar on a GNOME desktop. Another super popular desktop environment is KDE Plasma. It is used by default by Kubuntu, OpenSUSE, KDE Neon, and many others. KDE Plasma focuses on providing a powerful and customizable desktop environment with many integrated applications. Featuring a start-like menu on the bottom left, Windows users should feel right at home here. Whilst GNOME and KDE are the most popular environments, they are by no means the only ones. Elementary OS, for example, uses the Pantheon desktop environment, which they developed themselves. Pantheon is known for being very slick and being the least customizable environment in the name of simplicity. Another popular desktop is Budgie, which is used and developed by Solus Linux, but also available on many other distributions, such as Ubuntu Budgie. Budgie focuses on minimalism and elegance. The final factor we'll consider here is package management. If you're unsure what a package manager is, check out these videos, where I explain what package managers are on Linux, macOS, and Windows. However, in short, a package manager is kind of like an app store, where you can discover, install, and update applications on your system. Debian derivatives use apt package management. Packages are made available in a repository, which you can then install on your system using the apt command or a front-end tool, such as the Pop Shop on Pop!OS or GNOME Software Center on others. Red Hat derivatives use an RPM package format, with DNF package manager used for finding, installing, and updating packages. Other than that though, it works pretty similar to apt. Arch uses Pacman to download and install packages from the Arch repositories. All three allow you to add custom repositories to install software not available in the official repos. In many cases, your distribution will also support some other package formats, such as Flatpak or AppImage, which installs an application and all its requirements into a container on your system, meaning the same package will install on any Linux distribution with support for the package format. So, those were some things to consider when choosing a Linux distribution. In summary, make sure you consider 1. The target user base. Is this distribution meant for beginners or Linux pros? 2. The intended use. Is this a general purpose distribution meant for everyday use? Or is this a specific tool, such as Kali Linux for penetration testing, or Chrome OS, which basically runs a browser? 3. The distro family. Now that you know a little bit about the main families of Linux distributions, you can tell quite a lot about a distribution just by knowing what family it forms part of. 4. The release cycle. If you're a power user, you may consider a distribution with frequent releases, or even rolling releases, so you always get the latest version of software. On the other hand, if you're a casual user, or you're running a server, you may want something with releases far between to ensure system stability. 5. Default desktop environment. Like simple, try GNOME. Like really, really simple, try Pantheon. Want all the bells and whistles and customizability? Try KDE. Although many distributions let you choose any desktop environment, sticking to the default or flagship desktop environment for your distro is probably a good idea, as most development effort will go there. And finally, 6. The package manager. Now this is less of a concern nowadays, but do take a look at how software is installed on the system, and the size of the software repository offered by the distribution, and how recent the updates are. Well, that's it for today. In the next video, I'll be giving you recommendations for distributions to try based on 4 different user categories. But until then, why not like this video and subscribe to TechGuru? Oh, and hit that bell notification icon to be notified when part 2 comes out. Also, if you want to really help this channel like these fantastic people on screen now, be sure to check me out on Patreon, where you can support me financially, get early access to videos, join an exclusive Patreon chat group, get your name in the credits, and more. I would certainly appreciate it. Finally, if you want to watch these videos outside of YouTube, check me out on Odyssey. I hope you found this video informative, and until next time, thanks for watching.